Okay, hi, it's me again. I want to give you a little bit of a tutorial, as promised, on how to think about and analyze threats to internal validity in a study. This is again a topic from Chapter 9, but it applies to Chapter 10 as well, and we had one assignment related to it. I haven't read those assignments yet, but I'm guessing this is never an easy task, so I'm guessing that students usually the first time around struggle on this kind of assignment and thinking about how to analyze a study in terms of these threats. So let me give you a little bit of background. I've got about 6 slides here to try to go over this and give you a feel for what's meant when what is meant when you analyze a study in terms of threats to internal validity. And this is very common activity when you're reviewing studies, when you're evaluating them for publication, that sort of thing. And let's see where this goes. So I'm going to minimize myself down to the corner here. I don't think I'll be too much in the way of this presentation. So, what are threats to internal validity? Well, the book defines them as saying that internal validity in a study exists if the observed effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable are real and not caused by extraneous factors, or what we might call extraneous variables. Another way of thinking about this is internal validity refers to our confidence in the study, specifically our confidence that the IV, the independent variable, caused the changes in the dependent variable or the outcome variable, and conversely our confidence that the extraneous variables or extraneous factors did not cause changes in the DV. Right? So what are extraneous variables? Well, extraneous variables are possible causes other than the independent variable. In research, they are plausible alternative explanations for the results, reasons why you might have seen a pattern of results that were not due to the independent variable. As we'll see, true experiments are designed to rule out these extraneous variables, these alternative explanations. In other words, to make them no longer plausible as explanations for the results, leading you to conclude that, well, what caused the difference? Well, it had to be the independent variable. And as we get into the example, I'll try to demonstrate that a little bit more. What we're going to learn is that compared to true experiments, other designs offer lesser degrees of confidence that such explanations are plausible. And Chapter 9 has lots of examples of study designs. They categorize them as pre-experimental, experimental, and quasi-experimental. And these designs do a more or less better job at ruling out these alternative explanations for the results. So, this concept of extraneous variables is kind of, perhaps kind of, not ambiguous, but not clear at this stage, kind of vague. The question is, are there lists of common alternative explanations for study results? And the answer is yes. And in research, we call these threats, quote unquote, to the internal validity of a study. And box 9.1 provides one list of these threats, or one explanation of these threats. Some of them are very common across textbooks. Sometimes people expand on this list, but this is one very common list of common threats to internal validity, right? And they include things like history. Did something, is it possible that something could have happened, from the beginning of the study to the end of the study that accounted for the results other than your independent variable? Maturation. Could the participants by natural processes have changed from the beginning to the end of the study that they're different, they're older, they're taller, that sort of thing, which could have accounted for the results of your study. Things like that. And I'll go through a few more when we get into the example. Okay, one of the assignments that's related to this, and we're going to repeat this assignment this week with a different article. So I'll give you some examples from the article that was provided in the first iteration of this assignment. So I provided you an article. This is an article I did a few years back on an alcohol risk reduction program. But what the assignment asked you to do was to read that article, and for each of those listed threats in Table 9.1, indicate its likelihood of operation using the following scale: not likely, possible, or likely, and then provide a brief explanation of your rating. Why the threat was or was not likely or very likely, or whatever decision you said. Why was it possible that it was operating or not possible that it was operating? The article that I gave you was a particularly poor design in terms of ruling out threats to internal validity. It essentially used what the book described as a one-group pretest-postest design. Again, this was an evaluation. It was a program evaluation of a brief intervention for alcohol misuse. There was only one group, which meant that everyone received the treatment, and we essentially looked at changes from baseline, or what we called assessment, to 6-month follow-up in a number of drinking outcomes. And there's a lot of information on this slide, but this is kind of the standard representation of the one group pretest post-test design. This is some of the nomenclature that's used to show that kind of design in the legend. And so we have an observation at time 1, an observation at time 2, and all of the participants, because there's no second group here, all of the participants received X, which is the basics intervention. And so this table down here is from the article and kind of shows you the time points. And so for the majority, we do have some additional data on audit scores. So we technically have 2 pre-test observations for the audit scores, and then 1 6-month observation for them. But most of the measures, we have assessment, which we consider observation 1, and then at 6 months, which is observation 2. And occurring between assessment and 6-month observation is our intervention X. So this table kind of encapsulates that. You don't really need the results from this table to complete this exercise. You can do it almost purely as a thought experiment to analyze these threats, because you can analyze them without knowing what the results were, but or what the dependent measures were, about whether or not they were plausibly operating or not. So I may not refer to many of these effects, but know that it works, or that it could operate in each one. So when I ask you to look at this study and say, are these threats to internal validity possible or plausible, or not possible or plausible? They can be ruled out, is another way of thinking about it. The task is to essentially go through these threats and say, well, is this a plausible or possible explanation for the results? And so I'll stick with the audit and in terms of the explanation. What we see is that the audit is a alcohol risk questionnaire. It's a very standardized instrument, been used in a lot of different contexts, that sort of thing. Very very reliable and valid instrument. So that you can glean from the article. We provided evidence of it. It's been used lots in this context. So we'll just look at that. And what we see is that although there's a slight drop from screening to assessment, after the intervention, we see that audit scores drop fairly dramatically. They're almost half of what they were at screening and assessment. Not quite, but almost half. This is a very significant effect if you know anything about statistics. So, from pretest to post-test, after the intervention, students are reporting a lot less alcohol risk. And we see that for a lot of other measures as well. A lot of other things change. But the question is, about the internal validity. Are those effects real? Are they due to the intervention? Or are there plausible extraneous factors that could have accounted for the results? And that list of common extraneous factors are the threats to internal validity. So I won't go through all of them for you, but I'll go through a few of them. So history. History asks whether or not an event could have happened between the assessment period and the 6-month follow-up. That could have caused these scores to change. That's not part of the intervention. That's something else, right? So one of the things you could say is that, well, history is plausible, perhaps. You might say, well, in between, there's 6 months of time here. It is possible, I guess, that that in between the assessment and 6-month follow-up, perhaps there was an accident with one of the kids at the school, or a local community event that everyone was aware of, where kids were injured in a drinking-related accident or something like that, and because of that event, drinking scores changed in people. Their attitudes towards risky drinking changed, and therefore the scores went down. The idea is that scores went down is not under question here. What is under question is, could the scores have dropped from this level of 10 to 6 because of historical events? And with a 6-month time frame, the answer is, yeah, it's plausible. It's possible. I don't know how likely it is, but that's not the point. Is it likely? Yeah, it's possible, right? It's a plausible alternative explanation. Okay, let's look at another one. Maturation. 6 months is maybe a long period of time, and so you might say, well, maybe drinking goes down because in that 6-month time frame, it's natural for college students to kind of get older and wiser and more mature. We sometimes talk about them maturing out of heavy drinking patterns. So, is it plausible that within 6 months' time, people matured, changed their attitudes towards drinking because they were now older, or took on adult roles and responsibilities? Maybe. It's open to interpretation. There's no way to rule it out. I'm not sure it's a defining factor, but I can't rule it out. So maturation is a possible alternative explanation, right? Let's skip on. Let's look at instrumentation. Well, instruments are not accurate or precise enough, do not measure what they're supposed to measure. I would rule this one out. I would say this one's unlikely, not plausible, not possible in this study, especially for instruments like the audit and the Rutgers Alcohol Problem Inventory, which have a large degree of validity and reliability, have been used a lot. It's less likely, right? One more, because I'm running out of my time and my 15-minute timer for these videos. Selection bias, right? Participants are selected in a non-random manner. Well, they're not selected here at all. And selection bias usually is a case when you have a control group and an experimental group. This study doesn't have a control group, so there's no real selection bias, right? Lastly, statistical regression is when you select people for extreme scores, which we did in this study. They were chosen to be in this because they were high scores. We did some analyses to examine the plausibility of statistical regression. Okay, I've got 15 seconds. Real quick, I'm going to finish up here, and then I can answer questions if you post them. Just know that, again, I said this is not a very strong design for this. The next assignment, next week's assignment, is a stronger design where I ask you to do